Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Neon and welcome back to another video, and in today's video we'll be checking out this Omen gaming PC from 2019. It's an HP Omen Gaming 25L GT11 0XXX. Anyways, apart from the awkward name, this computer is still pretty capable now even in 2025. Anyways, so I decided to benchmark it in 21 different games to see how well it holds up now. But yeah, other than that, let's just go over what's inside. Okay, before we get into the specs, I just want to give a quick disclaimer that most of the footage in this video was recorded via a pretty bad capture card, so I'm sorry if the footage as a whole isn't very up to par. Alright, so here's the PC, and as you guys can see, we're running everything off of a 500GB Western Digital SATA SSD. Now, if we move a little to the left, you can see the RX 5500 4GB model from AMD. And up here, we have the Ryzen 5 3500, so this is a 6-core 6-threaded CPU with a base clock speed of 3.6 GHz. And lastly, we have 60GB of DDR4 memory. Now, you may see that they're mismatched, but in this scenario, it doesn't really matter. I just needed it to have 16GB because some of the games we'll be testing out today are pretty intensive. Anyways, before we get into the video, I just want to say that if you find this video useful, make sure to like and subscribe if you like the content. Anyways, without further ado, let's get right into the benchmarks. Alrighty, so first up we have Cinebench R23, and if I'm being honest, the CPU isn't doing bad at all. Anyways, as you guys can see, the overall result is that the CPU is a little slower than the i7 7700K, which is still a pretty decent CPU even now. Although it is a little disappointing considering that this CPU has 2 more cores, but at the same time has 2 less threads. Alrighty, so the first game we'll be testing out is Apex Legends, and as you guys can see before we even drop into the map, it's actually not performing too bad. The CPU is at 100% utilization because it's literally loading everything in. But as you guys can see, just look at the frame rates. It's slowly going up, it's slowly creeping up as all the assets load in. Alrighty, so now that we've landed fully, as you guys can see, the FPS have kind of stabilized, and we're getting roughly around 100 to around 120 FPS, which honestly is really good considering that this GPU only has 4GB of VRAM. But yeah, other than that, I mean, the temperatures are fine. The only notable thing that I will say is the memory usage, but it's not even that bad. Overall, it's a really playable experience. Alrighty, so next up we have Call of Duty Black Ops 6 multiplayer, and as you guys can see, the FPS is doing pretty well. Now, this is a pretty big disclaimer and kind of important for a lot of people. We are using the FSR frame gen stuff, and some people don't really like that because they don't, like fake frames. But honestly, it's not even that noticeable, and it enhances the FPS to playable, levels. If you weren't using FSR frame gen or whatever it's called, you'd be getting like 60-50 FPS, and it would be pretty unplayable because of the stuttering. But thanks to it, it is a playable experience and overall, works perfectly well. Alrighty, so moving on from that, now we're going to be testing out Zombies, which has slightly different performance in multiplayer for whatever reason. But as you guys can see, the performance is perfectly playable. We're getting over 60 FPS. Now, you guys might be wondering why the CPU is at 100%, and the reason being is because AMD, or FSR frame gen, is pretty CPU intensive for whatever reason, especially on lower end CPUs. But yeah, honestly, it's a completely playable experience. We are using almost 13GB of RAM, so remember, keep that in mind. And the temperatures are looking a little toasty for the CPU, but that's honestly down to kind of the skimpy cooler that it has. Alrighty, so now moving on to Counter-Strike 2, you guys might notice that the MSI Afterburner overlay is not here because this game does not play nicely with that app for some reason. So we'll be using the Windows Xbox overlay thing. I don't know why this one's allowed, but the other one isn't. But enough of that. As you guys can see, the performance is actually pretty decent. We're getting well over 120 FPS, although this is a big caveat. For some reason, it likes to dip into like the lower 80s or 90s. Unfortunately, I didn't like take a look at like the 1% lows or anything like that. But yeah, for some reason, the game just dips. I don't really know why, but it's most likely because the game is running out of VRAM and it just doesn't know what to do. But yeah, other than that, the game is perfectly playable. If you're just needing to play this game, then yeah, this computer will do it perfectly fine. Alrighty, so now moving on to Destiny 2, as you guys can see, the performance is doing pretty well, honestly. We are on the medium setting, so it shouldn't be too crazy. And this game came out like forever ago, so yeah. Anyways, as you guys can see, there's a lot going on the screen, and the FPS aren't really dipping too much. We're still in the mid 80s to low 70s for the most part. But yeah, as you guys can see, perfectly playable. Alrighty, so now we put the game on the highest settings, and as you guys can see, we're still getting a little over 60 FPS, and it's still really playable. Now, you will see here that it might drop into the high 50s for a quick second, but other than that, on occasional, dipping here and there, which is perfectly normal, honestly, the game looks great, and it performs still really well. So honestly, I don't know why you would put the game at the highest settings. I would just stick to medium and, get those like 80, 90 FPS. But yeah, if you really want to bump the graphics all the way up, it will do perfectly fine. Anyways, now it is time to try out Doom Eternal, and as you guys can see, this is very impressive. We're getting well over 120 FPS, although on the low settings, but whatever. This game doesn't look bad on really any settings at all. But the map that we're in is the Super Gore Nest, and in my opinion, I think it's the most intensive map there is. Okay, ignore that I just missed that shot right there. But as you guys can see, even in this really intensive area, it's still getting 120 FPS or more, and you know, the CPU and the GPU are working hand in hand perfectly fine. Now this is really impressive. We are using less than 8 GB of RAM because this game is pretty well optimized. Now if we put the game on the high settings, you guys can see that we took a huge dip in performance, basically cutting our FPS in half. At certain points where the game gets really intensive, we can get 50 FPS or less. And the reason being is basically just because the GPU can't take it. You guys can see over there that the CPU is, 50% utilization. That's still pretty good, but the GPU is completely maxed out. Okay, so now it is time for Fallout 4, which a lot of people consider like an older title. But yeah, you guys can see the performance is pretty well, and if you guys haven't noticed, there is a 60 FPS cap in the game no matter what. You can disable it, but I recommend to keep it on mostly for like physics and stuff. But as you guys can see, looking into the water and all that stuff, the game is capped out at 60, perfectly fine. Not even using 100% of the GPU nor the CPU, so the game is performing perfectly well. And as we get closer to the Red Rocket Station, you could see Dogmeat over there. Yeah, so perfectly fine playable experience. So if you want to play Fallout 4, it'll work perfectly. Okay, so now it is time for the game that most of you guys are probably here for, and that is Fortnite. We are running the competitive settings, which is basically everything on low except for the view distance at far. And as you guys can see, the game is performing pretty well. Obviously, the FPS will dip when loading new parts of the map, but that's mostly because battle royales are just huge maps. Now, one thing that I do want to point out is that the first few games, the performance might be a little lower than expected, mostly because when downloading Fortnite onto a new computer, for some reason, it just takes a while for it to like fully utilize everything. Other than that, the gameplay is perfectly playable, it's smooth and rarely ever choppy for the most part. Now moving on to performance mode, as you guys can see, the FPS likes to fluctuate quite a lot while dropping into the map. But don't be alarmed, the game does this all the time basically. You guys literally can see the assets loading in real time. I'm sure that you guys can see, it was pretty obvious. But yeah, just looking around, the FPS aren't too terrible, and as everything kind of, loads in and everything stabilizes, once we get close to the ground, like now, and we land, we're getting around 120 to 160 FPS. This is a more than playable experience, and a lot of people would like this because a lot of people are nowadays just getting 120 or 165 Hz monitors because they've come down a lot in price. And yeah, honestly, the performance is perfectly fine and really playable. There are very few stutters, I will not lie. This is actually really stable. Alright, now moving on to Lethal Company, as you guys can see, loading into the planet. The FPS are well over 100 and it's perfectly playable for the most part. As you can see, as we scan some creatures and everything, just looking around, the FPS stabilize at around 120. And as we enter the facility, as you guys can see, the FPS kind of lower for whatever reason. I'm guessing it's because it loaded the entire facility all at once. But yeah, overall, the FPS are looking perfectly fine. We're getting well over 120 while everything is loaded in. And on top of that, GPU is not even being fully utilized, so you'll have a perfectly fine time playing this game. Anyways, moving on from that, next up we have Marvel Rivals, which in my opinion is one of the more intensive games we'll be checking out today. And if I'm being completely honest, it surprised me seeing how we're getting between 50 to 60 FPS on low 1080p. It does sometimes stutter and dip into the high 30s though when there's like a bunch of action going on, but other than that, it's playable, but I wouldn't recommend. Now, if we turn on FSR 3.0, the overall frame rate goes up maybe 5 to 10 FPS, but in the footage you can't really see that because there's a bunch of stuff happening causing like the frame rate to dip into the high to mid 50s. But other than that, this is probably the optimal way of playing Marvel Rivals in the long run. Now, if we keep FSR 3.0 on and turn on frame generation, we see almost a doubling of overall FPS, but this does make the game feel significantly more stable, but at the same time, it doesn't really feel like 120 FPS. It feels more like a jittery 80 to 90 FPS, but this is still probably the most optimal way to play the game. You maximize both FPS and it also gives you a smoother experience. Moving on to Need for Speed Heat on the high preset, we are getting a stable 70 or more FPS while driving around. Keep in mind that if you were to get in a race, the overall FPS would probably go down, maybe like 5 or 10, because there's a lot more car surrender, and also it's more CPU intensive since the AI uses like CPU to calculate what they do and whatnot. Overall, it's a very playable experience on this combination. Anyways, moving on to the next Need for Speed game, which is Need for Speed Unbound, the RX 5500 really begins to show its age, as it struggles a lot to push even 60 FPS in some parts of the city. And really, this is just because the game has a lot more things to render. However, when you're driving around like shown in the gameplay, your frames will fluctuate from around 50 to 60, which is still really playable. Also, keep in mind that you can always turn FSR2 to boost your FPS a little more. Other than that, the game is still super playable, and there really isn't much to complain about, apart from maybe like an occasional dip in frames every once in a while. Moving on to PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, or just PUBG, as we're dropping into the map, our frames are between 55 to 60 looking over this town. But yeah, as we land doing a completely unnecessary backflip, the FPS rapidly skyrocket into the 90 to 100 range. Overall, once on the ground, the GPU and CPU basically work together perfectly to give you a really playable experience. Like I said earlier in the video when benchmarking Fortnite, it's pretty common for the most intensive part of the Battle Royale game to be pretty early in the game, generally as everything is rendered and loads in. And this is a pretty good example of this because when we were landing, we were getting about 60-ish FPS, and now we're comfortably in the 80 to 100 range. Anyways, now it is time to benchmark Rainbow Six Siege on the high settings, and we are getting an impressive 120 FPS experience basically all the time. It's super playable with no crazy dips in performance like other games, and yeah, overall it's just buttery smooth with no hitching. However, don't be surprised if the FPS drop a little whenever there's like smokes and other operator abilities happening on screen, but other than that, it's perfectly playable. Anyways, moving on to a significantly less serious game, next up is R.E.P.O on the high settings. Now the little RX 5500 is working overtime to give us a solid 200 FPS experience. Overall, the game isn't super demanding, so this isn't particularly surprising, but it's really nice to see that the computer can still handle relatively modern indie titles. Oh, also, another thing that I wanted to point out is that this game is using less than 8 GB of RAM, which I find super nice considering that basically all games require 8 or more, or even 16 or more. Now, Resident Evil Village on the medium presets gives us a genuinely impressive 120 FPS while roaming the castle. However, the second we step foot inside the main hall, we take a solid 30 FPS drop in performance. Although this isn't really that noticeable since we're already getting well over 60 FPS. If we push the graphics up to the high settings, we effectively lose about 30% of our FPS, which is about 35 give or take. Now this is very noticeable when we enter the main hall of the castle. We dip into the mid 60s, but it's still above the 60 FPS gold standard, so it's okay. But you guys can choose if you prefer graphical fidelity over performance or vice versa. Anyways, moving on to one of, if not the most intensive game we'll be testing out today. We're going to be checking out Resident Evil 4 Remake, and the RX 5500 is impressing once again, getting around 50 FPS in the beginning sequence of the game. Sometimes the game dipped into the lower to mid 40s, but it was still pretty playable. However, once we got inside the house, the FPS basically tanked to around 30, almost going into around 29, 28, although it wasn't really shown in the video. Still playable, but the graphics card was really getting pushed to its absolute limit. Thankfully, Resident Evil 4 Remake has FSR2, which helps boost our FPS by around 10 or so. Now, this helps push the game to the above 60 FPS range, providing a smoother experience. Unfortunately, the game once again goes down to around 30 FPS once inside the house. Still completely playable if you're willing to compromise a little on the frame rate. Alrighty, so moving on to Schedule 1 on the high settings, we're getting a solid 60 FPS when exploring the town. Now, I don't really know why this game is so intensive, but in case you want a smoother experience, you can always lower the settings a little. Other than that, the game runs perfectly fine, and there's really not much else to say. You won't really have a problem playing a game like this on this computer. Moving on to the forest on the high preset as we grab the hatchet and grab a little snack before venturing outside. As you guys can see, we're getting well over 60 FPS and are comfortably getting around 75 to 85 FPS in a pretty plant dense area. But as we move away from spawn, we get around 90 plus, providing us a buttery smooth experience with no dips in performance. However, if you do find yourself in a pretty empty area, you can expect to get as high as 120 FPS. Overall, you'll have a perfectly fine time playing this game, and you can even bump the settings even higher if you want. Anyways, now we're going to be testing out tons of the forest on the medium settings, and we are getting between 40 to 50 FPS as we stroll around this little river and go into some bushes. But yeah, believe it or not, this is actually pretty impressive considering how good the game looks. But yeah, it's performing pretty reasonably for its age. But if we enable FSR3, we get a decent 10 to 15 FPS boost while playing, while costing essentially no downside in graphics. Well, that is unless you look really closely, which most people won't really do. This is great for the RX 5500, which was struggling to push over 60 FPS. But yeah, as we walk around the bushes and trees, the FPS do dip into the mid to high 60s, but other than that, the game looks great and plays super well. Alrighty, so in Subnautica below zero on the high preset, we are getting a stable 60 to 70 FPS while exploring the kelp forest, and I guess you can say the safe shallows. But yeah, honestly, I wouldn't run the game on the high settings since you can barely make out the difference between medium and high, while basically your FPS get cut in half. Still perfectly playable, but once again, the 5500's 4GB of VRAM are basically holding it back a good amount. It really makes me wonder how much better it would be if it had 8GB instead of 4. Anyways, the last game that we're going to be checking out today is Valorant, which is yet another game that doesn't play nicely with the MSI Afterburner overlay. So on the right, you'll see the Xbox overlay. It'll tell you everything you need to know. Anyways, we are running the competitive settings, and as you guys can see, we're getting well over 120 FPS. It is perfectly playable. However, in a real match, your performance may vary depending on what's happening on the screen. But in deathmatch and lighter game modes, the game will be very playable with few or basically no dips in FPS. Anyways, that is all for today, guys. So if you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, make sure to like and subscribe for more. But yeah, I'll see you guys next time.